From New York, this is Democracy Now!
The memories from those 2 days will undeniably haunt me for the rest of my life. I will never forget what it was like to watch Nazis march on a campus that I called home.
4 years after the deadly white supremacist Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, jury selection's underway in a federal civil trial where organizers are charged with an unlawful conspiracy to commit violent acts. We'll get the latest. Then we look at a pair of hunger strikes. In New York, a group of taxi drivers and their allies have begun their second week without food, demanding debt relief.
We do not want to be here. We do not want to do this. But we will do this for as long as we have to, because a city-backed guarantee is non-negotiable.
Then we go to Washington, D.C., where 5 climate activists are on day 8 of a hunger strike outside the White House.
Ride and fight for us, not in the shadows of closed doors, but with all of us. The 5 of us starving in front of your home, and the millions of us ready to build back the people's agenda you promised us. Biden, make the choice.
We speak to Steve Donziger, the environmental lawyer who was targeted by Chevron after he successfully sued the oil giant for ecological devastation in the Ecuadorian Amazon. Today, he must report to prison after over 800 days under house arrest for a misdemeanor. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres issued yet another stark warning just days ahead of the COP26 Global Climate Summit.
Less than 1 week before COP26 in Glasgow, we are still on track for climate catastrophe, even with the last announcements that were made. The 2021 Emissions Gap Report shows that with the present nationally determined contributions and other firm commitments of countries around the world, we are indeed on track for a catastrophic global temperature rise of around 2.7 degrees Celsius. Now, even if the announcements of the last few days will materialize, we would still be on track to clearly more than 2 degrees Celsius.
In some encouraging climate news, a new report highlights the power of the grassroots divestment movement, as some 1,500 institutions and other investors have committed to divesting $40 trillion in assets from fossil fuels over the past decade. In Brazil, a Senate committee has approved a report calling for criminal charges, including crimes against humanity, against far-right President Jair Bolsonaro over his deadly mishandling of the pandemic. The Senate report also accuses dozens of other officials and 2 companies of committing crimes. Brazil's reported over 600,000 COVID fatalities, the second highest official death toll after the U.S. In related news, Facebook and YouTube have removed a video by Bolsonaro in which he falsely claims COVID vaccines are linked to AIDS. Meanwhile, in the United States, Dr. Deborah Birx, former President Trump's coronavirus coordinator, told lawmakers over 130,000 lives could have been saved in the U.S. if the Trump administration had quickly implemented effective public health measures. Birx said the White House was too distracted by the election and ignored recommendations to slow down the pandemic. In vaccine news, an FDA panel voted to recommend the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID vaccine for children 5 to 11 years old, bringing it one step closer to becoming available for 28 million more kids as early as next week. Moderna said it would sell up to 110 million doses of its COVID-19 vaccine to African nations after coming under fire for only distributing its highly effective shot in wealthy countries. Pakistan's information minister warned Afghanistan is on the brink of collapse and urged the international community to engage with the Taliban and unfreeze billions of dollars of Afghan assets overseas in order to prevent a humanitarian disaster. The UN warned over half the Afghan population is likely to face acute food insecurity this winter. 45% of the population, nearly 19 million Afghans, are already experiencing high levels of food insecurity. The economic crisis following the Taliban takeover in August has compounded an already dire situation marked by massive displacement from the conflict and a severe drought in a majority rural nation. Afghanistan's fragile health system is also facing critical shortages of medicine, food for malnourished children and staff. This is a supervisor in the nursery ward of Kabul's main children's hospital.
Our request for the current government is to increase the number of our staff because every nurse is usually responsible for about 4 children. And now, due to a lack of staff, every nurse is taking care of 24 children.
In related news, a Pentagon official told Congress Tuesday the Islamic State of Afghanistan could be capable of attacking the U.S. within 6 months. 4 people, 3 of them children, died Tuesday as they attempted to cross the Aegean Sea in an overcrowded dinghy. 22 others were rescued. The boat was traveling from Turkey to Greece, a common route into the European Union for refugees. In Ecuador, thousands of people took to the streets around the country for another round of indigenous-led protests against a hike in fuel prices and other economic policies pushed by the right-wing government of President Guillermo Lasso. Some 36 people were arrested as protesters blocked roads.
We do not agree with the economic measures being implemented, which passes the crisis onto the shoulders of the workers and the middle classes of the country.
In Colombia, another indigenous Misak leader has been assassinated in the region of Cauca. 34-year-old Nazaria Calambas was former mayor and community organizer. She was reportedly gunned down by 3 unknown assailants. Misak indigenous women denounced the killing and are demanding the Colombian government provide protection against skyrocketing violence. Over 100 indigenous leaders and other human rights defenders have been assassinated in Colombia this year alone. The African Union suspended Sudan over its military coup. The suspension will remain in place until the civilian-led transitional government is restored. Meanwhile, the deposed Prime Minister, Abdullah Hamdok, was allowed to return home, according to his office, after being detained by the coup forces, sparking widespread protests. In Kenosha, Wisconsin, the judge overseeing the murder trial of Kyle Rittenhouse has ruled the 3 protesters shot by the white teenager during racial justice protests last year cannot be labeled victims during the trial, but can be called rioters, looters, or arsonists if the defense can provide evidence to justify such terms. 2 of the protesters, Anthony Huber and Joseph Rosenbaum, were killed by Rittenhouse. The trial will start next week, November 1st. Senate Democrats have unveiled a new plan centered around capital gains taxes on billionaires as lawmakers seek workarounds to help pay for the reconciliation package that's being obstructed by conservative Democrats Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. The tax would apply to just the 700 wealthiest people in the United States. In New York City, Amazon warehouse workers and labor organizers in Staten Island filed a petition with the National Labor Relations Board to hold a union election. It's the 2nd time this year Amazon workers are attempting to form the company's first-ever U.S. union. The New York effort was led by Christian Smalls, who was fired by Amazon last year for organizing a strike demanding better worker protections amidst the pandemic. Smalls was met by cheers after filing the petition with the NLRB.
That's it, y'all. We did it. It's officially done. Notice to employees will be sent out in a matter of a week. Everybody in the facilities will be notified that a petition has been filed. Hell yeah.
Yay! In Chicago, tortilla manufacturer El Milagro is facing city and state investigations into its labor conditions following worker walkouts and protests denouncing low pay, staff shortages, and workplace abuse, including intimidation and sexual harassment. You can go to democracynow.org to see our interviews around that subject. A Senate committee held a hearing Tuesday on the mounting threats to election officials. Arizona Secretary of State Katie Hobbs testified before lawmakers.
2 weeks after the election, armed protesters gathered outside my home and chanted, "Katie, come out and play. We are watching you." I never expected that holding this office would result in far-right trolls threatening my children, threatening my husband's employment at a children's hospital, or calling my office saying I deserve to die and asking, "What is she wearing today?" so she'll be easy to get. These threats have continued against me and others. But what concerns me more is the near constant harassment faced by the public servants who administer our elections.
Arizona Secretary of State Katie Hobbs is now running for Arizona governor. Earlier this year, the Justice Department launched a new task force to tackle the rise in threats against election officials. Former Weather Underground member David Gilbert has been granted parole after spending 40 years in prison. He's scheduled for release November 30th. 77-year-old Gilbert was incarcerated for his role in the robbery of an armored truck in 1981 that left a security guard and 2 police officers dead. RAP, that's Release Aging People in Prison campaign, said, quote, Mr. Gilbert spent decades in prison creating rehabilitative programs and has been an unparalleled positive influence on the lives of countless incarcerated people. There's no doubt he will be an asset to his community, unquote. David Gilbert's son is Chesa Boudin, who's serving as district attorney of San Francisco. And after nearly 50 years behind bars, former Black Panther Russell Maroon Shoatz was freed from prison in Pennsylvania Tuesday after a judge granted his compassionate release the day before. Shoatz was sentenced to life without parole in the 1970 attack on a Philadelphia police station that left 1 officer dead and another wounded. He escaped prison twice, earning him the nickname Maroon, and endured 22 consecutive years of solitary confinement. Shoatz is now entering hospice care. He has stage 4 colorectal cancer and must receive nutrition through an IV. This is his son, Russell Shoatz III, speaking Monday.
What's in the transcripts are the evidence that the prisons don't have the capabilities to take care of not just their healthy prisoners, they definitely don't have the ability to take care of their geriatric prisoners, and that they have effectively killed my father.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. 4 years after the deadly white supremacist Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, jury selection has begun in a federal civil trial that charges the organizers with an unlawful conspiracy to commit violent acts. On August 11, 2017, in what's been billed as a climax to a summer of hate, several hundred white supremacists marched with tiki torches across the University of Virginia, surrounding a statue of Thomas Jefferson, chanting, "You will not replace us, Jews will not replace us, and white lives matter." At the next day's Unite the Right rally in downtown Charlottesville, more than 1,000 white supremacists marched to a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Thousands of counter-protesters also descended on the city, including clergy, students, Black Lives Matter activists, and protesters with the anti-fascist movement known as Antifa. Even as fights broke out, witnesses report police did little to intervene. Around 1:45 in the afternoon that day, self-described neo-Nazi James Alex Fields slammed his car into a crowd of anti-racist counter-protesters, killing Heather Heyer and injuring at least 35 others. Fields was later sentenced to life in prison. Those now charged in this civil trial for the violence in Charlottesville include Jason Kessler, the main organizer, and white supremacist Richard Spencer, who spoke at the event. The civil lawsuit cites an 1871 law known as the Ku Klux Klan Act, which allows private citizens to sue other citizens for civil rights violations. This is Elizabeth Sines, one of the plaintiffs in the case, speaking about what she witnessed.
The memories from those 2 days will undeniably haunt me for the rest of my life. I will never forget what it was like to watch Nazis march on a campus that I called home. I will never forget watching them attack my fellow students, or the feeling of running from my life through streets I had walked with friends and family countless times before. I don't think anything can ever really prepare you to witness something so horrific. Watching your home be overrun by people who wish to cause as much harm and wreak as much havoc as possible.
The lawsuit was filed by the civil rights group Integrity First for America. Much of the case is based on an extensive paper trail left behind by organizers of the Unite the Right rally in online chat rooms. One of the plaintiff's lawyers, Karen Dunn, told CNN what most stood out to her in the documents.
The image that has stuck with me ever since the beginning of the case was one of the Discord post pictures. It shows a tractor running people over, and it's called the Protester Digester. Look, there's many posts in this case about running over people with cars prior to the car attack on August 12th. But that one to me was like, I can't get it out of my head.
For more, we're joined by Dahlia Lithwick, Slate.com's senior editor and senior legal correspondent, longtime resident of Charlottesville for 18 years. She was living there at the time of the Unite the Right riot in 2017. Dahlia, welcome back to Democracy Now! This is a highly unusual court case as the jury selection continues. Can you explain more about what it is all about?
Essentially, I think the way to think about it, Amy, is if the Trump Justice Department had been doing their job at the time, they would have brought some kind of civil rights action in the wake of Charlottesville to hold to account the organizers of this rally, who, as you've just said, were clearly planning, thinking about, anticipating violence and harm and mayhem and terrorizing the local community. Nobody did that at the Justice Department. As you recall, President Trump at the time said there were very fine people on both sides of that protest. And so this is a lawsuit that, as you said, Karen Dunn, Robbie Kaplan, and their associates brought into the vacuum and essentially said, fine, we are going to dust off the KKK Act of 1871. It has not been used recently at all, but it does give a sort of a template for what you can do if your civil rights were violated, how you can bring a civil suit, and essentially hold to account the people who came to your town to terrorize you on the basis of race. And so in a sense, it's a novel, it's a very sweeping lawsuit. We've seen criminal lawsuits against some of the folks who've been involved, but this isn't really an effort to bring a big, expansive, sprawling suit against all 24 of the organizations and organizers, and to say, if the government is not going to do this, we're going to do it. And all 9 of the plaintiffs who were harmed are saying, we want money damages. We want to know who your funding sources are. We want to understand how these networks of hate groups work together. And it is kind of an attempt to shake up the entire day and display to the public what happened and how do we hold people accountable.
So explain who exactly is on trial. And to be clear, if found guilty, they don't go to prison.
Right. And there's not even a finding of guilt because it's a civil trial. So there is a dollar amount that has not been named yet. Judge Norman Moon at some point can set the damages amount. But the groups that are involved are some of the who's who of the alt-right movement. As you already said, Richard Spencer, who famously said, Heil Trump right after the election and says he coined the term alt-right. Jason Kessler, who was the local point person in the trial, Chris Cantwell, the so-called crying Nazi, a bunch of different Klan groups who showed up that day. And some of these defendants have already had judgment against them for refusing to participate in the trial. Some of them haven't shown up. Both Spencer and Chris Cantwell are defending themselves. They don't have attorneys. So you have this kind of motley crew of defendants who were involved at various levels. And then, as you said, there is this 5.3 terabytes of digital evidence that shows that for weeks in advance, they were planning what to wear, what kinds of things to bring that they could use as weapons. They were chatting, as you said, about what it involves to hit someone with a car and what the law says to protect you. And so I think this is an effort to get all of them lined up to tell the entire pixelated story of what was done, and then the judge will find money damages. I think the long-term hope is to bankrupt the groups as well.
And how do you answer what these white supremacists like Richard Spencer, who is representing himself, are saying that this is an attack on freedom of speech?
That's always been their defense. They essentially have two claims. One is that this was just a peaceful march. They came to protest. This is core First Amendment right to assemble and the core First Amendment right to protest. The answer is it stopped being a protest when it became clear that they were coming in full body armor with flaming torches and other weapons of war, and that they never intended to have a peaceful rally. In some sense, I think the argument is as soon as people were bringing guns into the mix, as soon as they were bringing spears into the mix, they lost the right to say this was simply a peaceful march. Now, Richard Spencer and his colleagues are saying that's the police fault. You know, that they are citing to a report that came out, an extensive report that came out after August 12th, saying that the police presence was in fact lackluster, that both the state of Virginia and the city of Charlottesville were not well organized. And so they're going to say it was free speech, it's the police's fault, and also they're going to blame Antifa. As you said in the introduction, they're saying that all of the violence was instigated by Antifa, the peaceful clergy who were protesting that day, and the other counter-protesters who showed up to try to claim the space in town.
Can you talk about who is bringing this case? For example, Roberta Kaplan, who you've called the Attorney General for the Resistance, and Integrity First for America.
Integrity First for America is a group that was created to help fund the trial. And I should note that Karen Dunn and Robbie Kaplan, I think you had Karen in the intro, are the two lead lawyers, and then there's a team around them. And I think that, again, they felt that they had to stand up and do this when nothing else was being done. And what they are doing essentially is saying, if this can be done here, we can see this done. For instance, we're seeing the KKK Act now has been invoked against some of the January 6th rioters from 2021. So they really feel as though this is an old statute that is still really on point in this moment of rising white supremacy, anti-Black hate, anti-Semitism. And so I think that what they're trying to do, Robbie and Karen would say, is to create a roadmap through how we hold very violent, racist, quote-unquote protesters who intend to bring mayhem, how we hold them to account.
You have this going on in Charlottesville. And in Washington, D.C., you have the Congressional Select Committee that is investigating whether it's a conspiracy of high-level Trump people, including President Trump, Congress members, lawyers like Giuliani and Eastman, a gathering of Giuliani and others at the Willard Hotel nearby to coordinate what ultimately became this white supremacist violent attack on the Capitol. Can you talk about that and how these two relate?
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, all of the folks who are on the hook for these conspiracies keep invoking that they were just speaking. They were just floating ideas. But any conspiracy at some level involves speaking, right? If there's a conspiracy to rob a bank, you can't say, oh, I was just exercising my free speech right to ask someone to bring a getaway car. And so in a sense, I think the lie is anything is protected, any speech is protected. John Eastman's memo explaining to then Vice President Pence how to do a coup is just a sort of free-floating, playing around with constitutional ideas. No, if you are in agreement with a bunch of people to break the law, that's a conspiracy, and that's not protected speech. It's not protest. And so I think what you're going to see in all of these cases is attempts to say that each of the players in both situations, both in Charlottesville and on January 6th, we're not intending to have people come and kill people, hurt people, dress in Kevlar vests, carry weapons of war. They were just trying to have a protest, and it got out of hand, and maybe we should blame the police or maybe we should blame the counter-protesters. But in both cases, I think really it puts the lie to the notion that any and all speech that is done in order to further a conspiracy to hurt people is protected speech. And so I think in some sense, the conspiracy claim helps get you over the argument that this is just sort of idle chatter and puts you squarely into the realm of once you are plotting to do violence, to have a coup in one case, to have a violent anti-Semitic, anti-Black mob riot and hurt people, you're out of the world of this is a peaceful protest and into the world of conspiracy to do harm.
It is amazing to see all of these issues now in various levels of court or in Congress. I want to also go to Kenosha, Wisconsin, where the judge overseeing the murder trial of Kyle Rittenhouse has ruled that the 3 protesters that this white teenager shot, 2 of them killing them during racial justice protests last year, cannot be called victims during the trial. Only rioters, looters, or arsonists if the defense can provide evidence to justify such terms. Again, 2 of the protesters, Anthony Huber and Joseph Rosenbaum, were killed by Rittenhouse. This trial beginning next week. Can you explain?
To be fair, the judge in that case, this is an ongoing policy. He has a longstanding policy. He says that you can't call someone a victim until the crime has been proven. But you're quite right, Amy, in that it goes exactly to the language of what is neutrality. The judge in that case said the word victim is too inflammatory. We don't want to inflame the jury. Apparently, the words arsonist and looter and rioter are not. And we're seeing exactly the same dynamic playing out in jury selection. We're on day 3 now of jury selection in Charlottesville, where the language of neutrality, the language of we want to just have an even playing field, we want people to have open minds, means that potential jurors who say things like, I thought they were evil, I think Nazis are evil, those kinds of people are bounced because that's not neutral language. And in some sense, what it tells me in both of these instances is that the framing of being sort of open-minded and neutral, in one case about somebody who armed himself with a gun and went to kill anti-racist protesters, in another case, people who came to a town with the intention of saying Sig Heil, blood and soil, burn the synagogue down, that the appropriate way to judge them is with this neutral language of both sides. And it's chilling that that's what the legal system requires, that that's viewed as a sort of neutral, objective setting.
Dahlia Lithwick, I want to thank you for being with us, Slate.com senior editor and senior legal correspondent, longtime resident of Charlottesville for 18 years, lived there at the time of the Unite the Right rally riot in August 2017. Coming up, we look at a pair of hunger strikes being held by taxi drivers in New York and climate activists in Washington, D.C. And then we speak to Steve Donziger, the environmental attorney who is headed to jail today. Stay with us. Dia Hai by Aruj Aftab. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A group of New York City taxi drivers and allies have entered their second week on hunger strike to demand New York City enact debt relief for thousands of drivers. Many taxi drivers are facing economic devastation after buying taxi medallions from the city at artificially inflated costs. In 2014, the price of medallions soared to around $1 million. Today, they're worth maybe $100,000, leaving drivers in massive debt and financial ruin. At least 9 drivers have died by suicide. To compound the problem, taxi ridership has also plummeted in New York due to the pandemic and the rise of ride-sharing apps like Uber and Lyft. We're joined now by 2 people who are on hunger strike. Zohran Mamdani is a New York State Assembly member. He's on day 8 of the hunger strike in solidarity with the New York City taxi drivers. With us also is taxi driver Augustine Tang, who's been on hunger strike for 6 days. Augustine, let's begin with you. As you sit in your cab, can you talk about why you went on hunger strike and the kind of devastation you have faced?
Well, I've been on hunger strike before the 6,000 families that has been affected by this medallion crisis. These men and women has invested in the city and drove 20, 30, 40 years of their lives just to have their retirement taken away from them, and also having about to lose their homes and their jobs as well, too.
And Zohran Mamdani, you're a state legislator in New York. Why are you participating in this hunger strike?
I'm participating in solidarity with the Taxi Worker Alliance and to try and bring to light what the consequences are of the city's inaction for many years and now their completely insufficient plan for debt relief. Because, we started this hunger strike last Wednesday. We've now completed 7 full days of being without food, one of the most basic elements of dignity. And the consequences we have seen in our own bodies, an inability to sleep, unrelenting hunger, moments of blurred vision, stress, headaches. These are the same consequences that I heard drivers talk about when they say what the physical realities are of being hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, unable to take care of your family and seeing no way out. So it's important for us as legislators to bring to light what it is that people are suffering from out of view of those in the political elite and bring it right front and center in front of City Hall.
And what has Mayor Bill de Blasio said, State Legislator Mamdani?
As of now, we haven't had any direct contact from the mayor, and that's despite my many, many requests personally to his staff at City Hall, as well as the very public requests from myself and from the union. But we do hear his responses to questions from the media. And thus far, his stance has still been one of defending a plan which no other elected official will publicly defend.
Augustine Tang, if you can talk about the deaths by suicide of taxi drivers as you sit there in your car on day 6 of your hunger strike, and also talk about how you got this taxi cab that you're sitting in.
Of course. Well, when I first started driving, I inherited the medallion from my father who passed away in 2015, and also a $530,000 debt. Unfortunately, I had to make a decision to take care of my grandmother, his mother, and I made that decision to move back with her and try to carry on his legacy. And when I first started, I have met a fellow taxi driver and medallion owner that his name was Kenny Chow, and unfortunately, he was one of the 9 drivers that died by suicide. And for me, ever since then, I've been actively trying to speak up about this issue and trying to do as much as I can, because I don't feel like any driver should feel that way ever again. It's incredibly sad, and the longer I do this, the sadder the stories have become. About these medallion drivers, medallion owners that have just went into financial ruin, and really there was no way out.
Zoran Mamdani, explain how the system worked, how a medallion worth a few years ago supposedly $1 million is now worth maybe $100,000, and the role of the apps Uber and Lyft.
Absolutely. So the medallion for decades has been worth between, let's say, $130,000 to $200,000. The medallion system, for those who don't know, is the licensing by which cabs are allowed to pick up passengers from across the 5 boroughs. And this was created in the early 20th century. The medallion prices started to increase when the Bloomberg administration came into power in 2001 and saw that the city had a $3.1 billion deficit. They pinpointed medallions as a means of making up that revenue, and over the next decade and some change made $855 million off of the sale of new medallions, as well as a processing fee they added to all sales of 5%. So if you bought a medallion for $1 million, that was an additional $50,000 you would have to pay to New York City. Then, as this price increased because of the need to seek revenue from it, they artificially inflated it, and they did so knowingly, because there was a memo within city agencies that said that the price of the medallion was outstripping its actual worth, because we went from about $200,000 to, as you said, $1 million, and nothing about the market was fundamentally changing. So the city knew that these drivers simply could not afford the loan terms that they were agreeing to when they put $1 million down to drive a yellow cab. And then as we got into 2012, 2013, 2014, and it became the de Blasio administration, we had the mayoralty allow for Lyft, Uber, and rideshare companies in general to flood the market when so much of the worth of the medallion and the ability of these drivers to make a decent living was predicated on the fact that they had an exclusive license to operate as taxis. And now you had 100,000 additional cars operating in that same market. And studies have shown that taxi drivers have lost north of 40% of their income, with inflation accounted for, because of that. And so that's where the city's culpability comes from. It's from the fact that they artificially inflated these medallions, that they let Lyft and Uber come into this market, and that they welcomed in lenders which had been barred from operating in the housing market post-2008 to operate in this medallion market, trapping immigrant drivers in predatory debt agreements.
Finally, Augustine, can you lay out your day before the hunger strike? How long you have to work in your car, your one example of so many in New York City, and what this means?
Of course. Well, to be honest, driving in the city is not easy, especially with the influx of taxis. And many of us have to drive at least 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, in order to manage these medallions. My loans itself is $2,851 before the pandemic, and operating costs of a taxi, you're talking about maintenance, you're talking about gas, just credit card fees and surcharges. It amounts to a lot, and it's difficult to make ends meet. Even having a second driver, you'll have things like workers' comp and insurance and things, and it's incredibly tough driving in a city like New York City. And I got to say, I give it to the people who've been doing it for 20, 30, 40 years. It's incredibly hard on the body. It's a very unhealthy job. But for those who wanted to provide for the family,
and during COVID, particularly dangerous?
Exactly, especially for our senior drivers. Of course, COVID was really changed a lot of things, because at least senior drivers, didn't want to take that risk and bring it back to the family, or even just get COVID themselves.
What are your final words to the mayor today?
Well, to the mayor, I'll tell him to come down to City Hall and church over here on Broadway and Murray. For many of us, we have been out here for 39 days straight, 24/7. There's always been a taxi here, always been someone sleeping in their cars. For many of us, we're tired, but we understand this fight. It's more important than just a good night's rest or food in my belly. We understand that this is worth it because of our futures.
Well, I want to thank you both for being with us. Augustine Tang, he's a taxi driver here in New York on day 6 of a hunger strike. Before that, a month-long vigil outside City Hall. And Zoran Mandani, a New York Assembly member on day 8 of his hunger strike. He is the son of the great filmmaker Mira Nair and Professor Mahmoud Mandani. We thank you both for being with us. We turn now to another hunger strike hundreds of miles south in Washington, D.C., where a group of 5 climate activists have entered their 8th day without food, demanding President Biden do more to address the climate emergency. The activists have spent most of the past week outside the White House calling for passage of the full $3.5 trillion Build Back Better plan to combat the climate crisis and expand the nation's social safety net. The size of the bill has been slashed in half, in part due to opposition from Democratic Senator Joe Manchin, who's made millions of dollars in coal companies in his home state of West Virginia and is the recipient of the most oil, gas, and coal money in Senate. On Tuesday, one of the hunger strikers, Abby Leedy, confronted Manchin after he spoke at the Economic Club of D.C. Listen closely.
I'm going to grow up as a topic climate emergency. You continue to block the civilian climate corps, the methane emissions. Joe Manchin,
Your name?
My name is Abby.
Abby, let me tell you, we've done more in the United States of America than any other country. All the pollution's coming from Haiti.
Joe Manchin, if the United States of America does not cut our emissions by at least 50%, I'm going to grow up and just not stop climate emergency. I have been on hunger strike. We haven't eaten for 7 days, Joe.
Abby Leedy is confronting Senator Manchin from a wheelchair after he spoke at the Economic Club of D.C. Several members of Congress have visited the climate hunger strikers outside the White House. Congressmember Rashida Tlaib posted this video on Twitter Tuesday.
So I just want to thank them from somebody that represents the 3rd poorest congressional district. One of the most polluted zip codes in the state of Michigan is in my district. So I'm here in solidarity and hope that other members of Congress come and show solidarity with so many of these courageous leaders. In my book, these are the real leaders that we need for our country right now. This is how we make sure that Earth stops burning. This is how we make sure there's a future for my kids and yours. So please join me in showing solidarity and support for so many that are on the front lines right here in front of the White House demanding justice for climate.
That's Congressmember Rashida Tlaib standing in front of the hunger strikers. We're joined by one of them now, Kiedis Girma. He's on the 8th day of a hunger strike. He was hospitalized Saturday, but decided to continue with the hunger strike. A climate activist from Texas. Kiedis has lived since coming to the United States as a child from Ethiopia in Texas. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Kiedis. You are endangering your health clearly. You were hospitalized, but you're still on hunger strike. Why?
I'm on a hunger strike for my family and my future and the promises that the president made to young people who put him in office. I'm in hunger strike after having a dangerously low blood sugar amount because the president of the United States made promises when he was running for office in the couple of months leading up to this deal, and even while this deal is being negotiated, that he would deliver the climate mandate that he was elected on. I'm on a hunger strike because this is what the world needs. The world needs the president of the United States to fight for it. We need the president to put the children of the future, the children of today, at the center of his agenda, and not Exxon officials and the representatives that fight for oil and gas billionaires.
According to a report from Axios, the White House is privately telling lawmakers the climate portion of Biden's roughly $2 trillion social spending plan is mostly settled and will likely cost more than half a $500 billion. Do you think this is enough?
It is simply not enough. President Biden has so much power and there's so many different things that he could be fighting for that he simply won't. Our president only knows how to fight in the shadows. He only knows how to cut smaller and smaller deals with bought-out politicians like Manchin and Sinema, and he doesn't know how to fight the moral fight that we need in the public sphere. The president of the United States today, in this moment, could end Line 3. He could end offshore drilling. He has dozens of executive actions that he could execute to actually get us to the 50% cuts in emissions by 2030 that he promised us. And right now, the president is too much of a coward to actually fight for the people that put him in office.
What message do you have for President Biden as he heads to the UN Climate Summit? Interesting that he announced it last week that he was going with a number of members of his cabinet to Glasgow. This was at the time that hundreds of people, mainly indigenous protesters, were getting arrested outside in Washington, D.C.
I'm asking my president to fight for me. I'm asking my president to fight for me and my friends who are starving outside of his home. I'm asking the president to fight for the people that put him in office and not the special interests that keep him from fighting for his own agenda. I'm asking the president of the United States to be the president of the United States and to fight for climate, to fight to make sure that the next wildfire, to make sure that the next hurricane, to make sure the next possibility of famine is not as extreme as it has to be. And right now, I feel like the president of the United States is fighting for a superstorm and not for kids. And I need the president of the United States to start fighting for me.
Kate Esguerra, we want to thank you for being with us. How long do you plan on this hunger strike?
I am on an indefinite hunger strike until the president of the United States delivers the promises of 50% emission cuts by 2030.
I want to thank you again on day 8 of the hunger strike in Washington, D.C., part of the Sunrise Movement. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we continue on the issue of climate, on the environment. We'll speak with an attorney who's going to prison today, Stephen Donziger, who successfully sued Chevron for its devastation of the Ecuadorian rainforest. Stay with us.
He nacido entre montañas, entre tejidos de tierra, aire y agua y fuego, palabras sin miedo, como aquel danzante en la esquina del universo. Soy un granito de maíz en el surco del tiempo, sembrada en un vientre de barro con rocío y canto de sol. Esto es lo que soy, esto es lo que soy. Como mis abuelas con su alma guerrera, como la tierra, yo tengo piel morena. Soy mujer indígena, nieta de la luna. Esta es mi fuerza. Como mis abuelas con su alma guerrera.
Mujer Indígena by Sarah Kurchich. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The environmental human rights lawyer, Stephen Donziger, is reporting to jail today after a federal appellate court rejected his request for bail pending his appeal. Earlier this month, Steve Donziger was sentenced to 6 months in prison for contempt of court, a misdemeanor. Donziger has already spent over 2 years under house arrest after being targeted by the oil giant Chevron. The case stems from Steve's role in suing Chevron on behalf of 30,000 Amazonian indigenous people for dumping 16 billion gallons of oil into their ancestral land in the Ecuadorian Amazon. 10 years ago, Ecuador's Supreme Court ordered Chevron to pay $18 billion. The landmark ruling was seen as a major victory for the environment and corporate accountability. But Chevron refused to pay or clean up the land. Instead, it launched a legal attack targeting Donziger. In July, a federal judge found him guilty of 6 counts of criminal contempt of court after he refused to turn over his computer and cell phone. In an unusual legal twist, the judge appointed a private law firm with ties to Chevron to prosecute Donziger after federal prosecutors declined to bring charges. Amnesty International recently called for his immediate release, saying he was being arbitrarily detained. The UN's Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has also called for his release. Well, as he prepares to report to prison later today, Steve Donziger is joining us from his home in New York, where he's been under house arrest for 813 days. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., there'll be a major news conference held today outside the Capitol. Steve Donziger, welcome back to Democracy Now! Where are you heading to prison today? We're talking about a misdemeanor. You've already been under house arrest for nearly 1,000 days.
It's just extraordinary, Amy. Thank you for the introduction. I mean, it pretty much captured it. What I'll say is I have to report to prison by 4:48 p.m. today, which is in itself highly unusual. I don't believe I'm guilty. No lawyer has ever spent more than 90 days in home confinement, maximum sentence ever given to a lawyer, convicted of my charge, which is misdemeanor contempt. I've already spent over 8 times that at home. And now on top of that, Judge Preska's trying to put me in prison for 6 months. And, another unusual feature is she's making me report, within 24 hours after this latest court ruling that came down yesterday, rather than allowing me time to report, in a normal course to a prison. So there's so much about this.
And which prison are you going to be held at?
I don't know yet. By forcing me in so quickly, Judge Preska, I believe, is trying to force me into a local federal jail that I think is very unsafe. I mean, I have no security risk at all. I've never been convicted. It's the lowest level offense. So normally I would go to a federal prison camp. And, we need time for the Bureau of Prisons to designate me to an appropriate facility. Instead, she's trying to force me very quickly, I think, into a local jail, which concerns me greatly, frankly. And I think that's one reason why Amnesty International put out an urgent action bulletin 2 days ago for people to write to the Attorney General Garland to just stop this case. I mean, the other crazy thing about this that is so disturbing, Amy, is that I was not prosecuted by the U.S. government. I was prosecuted by a private law firm, Seward and Kissel, appointed by a federal judge after the U.S. government declined to prosecute me. And the judge never disclosed that the law firm had Chevron as a client. So essentially, I'm being prosecuted by a Chevron law firm, a partner in a Chevron law firm, a private law firm, who deprived me of my liberty. I'm the only person ever charged with this offense held pre-trial at home or in prison. Never happened before for even a day. It's over 800 days. So, this is the first corporate prosecution in U.S. history. I have never seen a case like this, nor have other legal experts that work with me. And, we just think, to restore the rule of law as regards Steve Donziger and the people of Ecuador, this case has to be stopped and taken over by the Department of Justice. I mean, they could do what they want with it. I mean, if they want to prosecute me, but I need to be prosecuted by a neutral prosecutor, not by Chevron.
So I want to just talk about some of the people who are supposed to be at your news conference in Washington. We just interviewed a climate striker on a hunger strike in Washington, D.C., and we heard from Congressmember Rashida Tlaib. She'll be there at your news conference. Also, you have Chuy Garcia, Congressmember Jesus Chuy Garcia from Chicago, Congressmember Jim McGovern of Massachusetts, as well as a number of people from Amnesty International, Law Students for Climate Accountability. Talk about the significance. I mean, you have so many supporters at this point at high levels. Yet talk about what's at stake, what it is you exposed in Ecuador.
Well, I think the stakes are high, and it goes way beyond me personally. I mean, on a personal level, it hurts. I have a wife and a 15-year-old son, and, we're hurting, okay? But let's just get real here. What's really happening here is Chevron and it's these 2 judges and really allies of the fossil fuel industry are trying to use me as a weapon to intimidate activists and lawyers who do this work, who do the frontline work of defending the planet. What's at stake, really, I mean, not only my freedom, what's at stake is the ability to advocate for human rights in our society. I mean, the things I was charged with were I was a lawyer litigating various court orders, for years, ethically. I'm proud of my work. And this judge just went after me. I'm the only lawyer ever in U.S. history to be charged with criminal contempt of court for challenging a civil discovery order on appeal. That's essentially what happened. So, I'm calling on judges and people in Congress like, Representative Tlaib and Jim McGovern and, Cori Bush and others who stepped up for me to continue speaking out, to enlist more people. We need people in the Senate, and ultimately we need the Biden administration. I mean, I heard your previous guest. I mean, the Biden administration is essentially letting a climate change lawyer, me, an environmental justice lawyer, an indigenous rights lawyer, an earth defender, a water protector be locked up on American soil. And it's getting really embarrassing for our country. You know, it's not every day that Amnesty International issues an urgent action for an American citizen. It's probably the second time in 20 years that this has happened, okay? It's not every day that the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention issues an order that someone in the United States, his case is a violation of multiple provisions of international law and shows an appalling degree of a lack of impartiality by judges, you know? So our country needs to deal with this. It really goes to what kind of society we want to live in. And it really relates to the climate issue because, again, I believe this whole thing is being orchestrated by Chevron, not just for Chevron, but for the entire fossil fuel industry. They don't want people speaking out. They don't want successful litigation to hold them to account for their pollution in ways that will help save the planet. And I think ultimately that's what this is about, and people need to pay serious attention to what's happening.
Stephen Donziger, you have called the devastation in Ecuador the Amazon Chernobyl. Explain why. Explain the original lawsuit that resulted in an $18 billion judgment against Chevron.
Basically, Chevron, in the form of Texaco, its predecessor company, went into the Amazon of Ecuador and decided to create an operational system of literally hundreds of wells where they deliberately dumped toxic waste into waters, into rivers and streams that indigenous groups relied on for their drinking water, bathing, and fishing, creating a mass industrial poisoning of a 1,500 square mile area. And literally hundreds, if not thousands of people have died. I've been there over 250 times. The affected communities went to court. In the court, Chevron wanted the trial to happen in Ecuador. They won the case. Chevron has attacked me, attacked them for 10 years with the help of these federal judges. In the meantime, people are suffering. And, you know, the degree of contamination is appalling. I mean, it is the Amazon Chernobyl. It's the very definition of ecocide, in my opinion. I mean, that's just a deliberate decision in order to save money to dump 16 billion gallons of cancer-causing waste onto indigenous ancestral lands. And the problem is still there. The case has been going on 28 years. And no matter what happens to me, and I hope I'll be okay, I hope I'll get through this, I expect to get through this, the communities in Ecuador are suffering tremendously, and they need help. And Chevron needs to step up and comply with the rule of law and pay the judgment that it owes to the people of Ecuador.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Clearly, the fight against oil extraction in the Amazon continues. A lawsuit was filed just last week. Again, you tweeted yesterday around breaking news. You tweeted after, just to give people a sense, after 100 pages of legal briefing, the appellate court today denied my release in 10 words. This is not due process of law, nor is it justice. In these last 30 seconds, is it definite you will be jailed tonight?
Nothing's ever definite. We are going to make one final attempt to go back to my trial judge and ask for more time so I can get properly designated to an appropriate federal prison. I don't know if she'll grant it. We're going to do that shortly. I am prepared and fully expect to, around 2 o'clock today, leave my home on the Upper West Side of Manhattan and report to prison, where I will spend the next 6 months.
After serving over 2 years under house arrest for a misdemeanor, Stephen Donziger, the environmental lawyer targeted by Chevron after he successfully sued the oil giant for ecological devastation in the Ecuadorian Amazon. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Currently accepting applications for 2 positions, Director of Finance Administration, Human Resources Manager. Apply at democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman.